Welcome to Matter. Welcome to Patient Experience 2040. It's a new program that we are debuting this evening. We are delighted to produce it together with Salt Flats, which you'll hear a little bit more about. I'm Stephen Collins. I'm the CEO of Matter. Welcome to those of you on the live stream. Obviously, welcome to those of you who are here in the room with us. So at Matter, we built Matter as a healthcare technology incubator and innovation hub with a premise that collaboration is the best way to innovate in healthcare. Our mission is to accelerate the pace of change of healthcare. And we do three things. So we incubate startups. We've worked with about 750 companies since we opened in 2015. We have a suite of services to help them at different stages of growth. We provide innovation services to established companies, helping them make sense of and capitalize on value from emerging technologies. And we are a nexus for people who are passionate about healthcare innovation and healthcare transformation. And so we do a lot of events, including things like this. One of our event series that we've run for a number of years and we produced together with Hillrom and now with Baxter is called Healthcare 2040. Where we look at kind of what are different aspects of healthcare going to look like in the year 2040, and what do they look like today? What are the gaps? How can we get there? I mean, obviously we don't know what it's going to look like in 2040, but we can prognosticate and envision a future, dream of a future that we think is more effective, more human-centered than what we have today. We've really enjoyed that series. We've looked at things like operating rooms and primary care and different aspects of healthcare. And one of the things that we realized in our conversations with Salt Flats was that we could do a similar sort of lens around what the patient experience is going to be like in 2040, because hopefully it will be quite different than it is today. So our first program, we're going to dig in around Alzheimer's and dementia. Areas that have really been a conundrum for a lot of pharmaceutical companies for a number of years, areas with significant unmet medical needs, areas where the patient experience, the caregiver experience, the family experience is far from optimal. Envision what the future might look like and talk a little bit about the trajectory of how we might get there. We have a great panel. We will which you'll hear from in a moment. I want to now bring up Stephen Morales from Salt Flats. He's the Managing Director of Healthcare and Life Sciences. He's someone who I got to know a number of years, I think in the very early days of Matter. Yeah, for a long time ago. He's had a number of roles in the life sciences industry with Abbott. As a former Abbott person, I feel like it's always a good sign. With Merck, with Baxter, he was at Navigant for a number of years and really became closer to Matter during that time. He's been a leader of some life sciences startups himself, and then has joined Salt Flats and is leading up their healthcare and life sciences work. And he'll explain, for those of you who aren't familiar with Salt Flats, a little bit more about that. And then he will introduce our panelists and he'll moderate the discussion. So thank you for your partnership. Welcome, and I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Steve. It's wonderful to be back. As Steve said, I was a company here at Matter, as I'm sure a lot of our panelists will tell you that they have deep connections to Matter. Salt Flats, if you don't know, Salt Flats is a relatively new part of the Chicago healthcare ecosystem. We actually have a number of different services that we offer to startup companies, usually at early stages. We also have a venture capital arm that does investment in early stage companies as well. And part of the reason why we decided to focus on this particular topic tonight is that we realize how big of a problem this is going to be for not just the clinicians. We can talk a long time about all the therapeutics that are out there, all the different ways to potentially treat the problem. But for us in this room, we are going to see between now and in 2050 about a threefold increase in the number of individuals that have Alzheimer's in just the US. Today, that number is estimated to be around $300 billion in spend associated with that, so triple that, and we're looking at almost the size of a Facebook or Amazon. So what we try to do at Salt Flats is we take a multifactorial approach to solving problems, and of course, we want to make sure that whatever diseases that we are treating, we're treating cost effectively. But we recognize that there's also a lot of misalignment in the care system. And that's something that we try to dig into a lot with the companies that we work with. And last is that we are all our own healthcare providers in some respects. And we'll talk a little bit about that today. Whether you're a caregiver of someone with Alzheimer's or you're trying to decide, am I potentially suffering from mild cognitive impairment, you're seeking out information and bringing that information often to your caregiver, to your provider. But the way that we try to attack this is we have a multi-pronged approach. We recognize that we can't solve it within our own silos. And so that's part of the reason we bring this panel together. So at Salt Flats, as I said, we have an investment arm. We also have a consulting arm and a venture studio, which you'll be hearing about a little bit more in the future. But tonight, we're really going to focus our attention on the three great panelists that we've been able to bring together. So I'd like to invite them to come up and stay with me as we start the discussion. And as they're getting seated, just to give a little bit of background on myself, as Stephen said, I am a managing director with Salt Flats. I've been about 25 years in the industry, working in both medical devices, pharmaceuticals, and then also through consulting, working on the payer and provider side. Dr. Agarwal, do you want to give a brief intro?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Neelam Agarwal. I'm a cognitive neurologist at the Rush Alzheimer's Disease Center at Rush University Medical Center. And I do a combination of clinical work and research focusing on Alzheimer's and related dementias.
Dr. Rao?
Hi, my name is Dr. Anita Rao. I am the CEO and founder of NeuroCern. We're an AI informatics platform that provides insights to some clients in the healthcare verticals. I'm also a practicing cognitive neurologist like Dr. Agarwal here. I practice in the inpatient side, and I see neurological emergencies like stroke and epilepsy. And then I also wear different hats from the payer and provider side. I sit on the board of trustees for the Theta Care Health System, and then I'm on the national board for the Lewy Body Dementia Association.
Dr. Gregory?
Hi there. Good evening, everybody. I'm Sean Gregory. I'm Vice President of Health Econ and Market Access for Cognito Therapeutics. Cognito is a phase 3 medical device company with an indication for disease-modifying effect in Alzheimer's and mild cognitive impairment. Great to be here.
Great. So just to start off our conversation, Dr. Agarwal, I'll probably start with you. So we see that huge increase in the number of projected number of patients that are going to be facing Alzheimer's disease. How do you, as we think about the impact this is going to have on caregivers, on patients, what do you see as some of the key stress points that's going to create, that kind of growth is going to create in the future?
Yeah. And I think the key word he just said is stress points. There are stress points, and we're stressed right now. Okay, this isn't coming, this is happening right now. And the stress points that I'm seeing and my colleagues are seeing, and I'd like to hear what Dr. Rao's thoughts are, is that number one, there is also a lack of education of what is happening with dementia and Alzheimer's disease. What is consistently what we say normal aging versus aging where there's forgetfulness that's a little bit more than it should be. And trying to get that squared away with the public to say, no, this isn't normal. This isn't what we're expecting. There are people who are living to very high ages, doing very, very well. So I think that's the big thing that we're trying to get the education out. Now, with that education, the other stress point is we are missing communities where we know the rates of dementia are quite high. So we have these disparities, and they're there. They're not emerging. They're not developing. They're there. And the disparities are coming in our African American and our Hispanic communities and Native American. But also I want to bring in the Asian community is also not aware of how much dementia is really in the community. So we have to get the education out there. And then the other stress point that we're seeing as we, let's say, educate and diagnose is when we do diagnose, the specialists that are there to diagnose are limited. And this is tremendous stress on us because to come to see me or Dr. Rao, you know, they're a long wait period. So what happens then? People just don't come in. Or they go to maybe their primary care, which makes total sense, but the primary care may come back and say, I'm not equipped to understand what's happening. Basically educate us. And so then you can imagine what happens. People just say, okay, I'm just going to kind of ride with it. And then the last big one is once you make that diagnosis, what really stresses me out, frankly, is there is a lack of coordination of care from the diagnosis to the care to the execution of the plan. I would love to see a much more cohesive kind of basically program so that when you make that diagnosis, you know what people are going to expect, and that is causing tremendous stress.
Yeah, I would have to echo that. I think the disease journey for Alzheimer's disease and dementia is vastly different than other chronic medical diseases like hypertension or COPD. One of the biggest critical stress points for not just patients and caregivers has been access. Yeah. Like Dr. Agarwal says, the average wait time to see a neurologist right now is between 5 and 15 months. So imagine if you cannot see your cardiologist for the next 5 months, what does that mean to healthcare outcomes? What does that mean in terms of access to critical medications, trials, and then also just delays in diagnosis? So as Dr. Agarwal mentioned, there are regional differences in how neurologists and geriatricians are dispersed across the US. We were actually had the opportunity to be collaborative on a project called Dementia Neurology Deserts. And we identified, for instance, Wyoming was the biggest neurology desert where there was only a handful of neurologists per 10,000 patients. So you can imagine for someone living in Wyoming, what this means is they're going to have longer wait times, they may have poor healthcare outcomes, and the payer as well is going to experience the shortage of neurologists in terms of utilization.
Very interesting. So I want to go back to the coordination of care comment because when you look across patient experience, that is by far the area that patients always complain about. Coordination of care is often about data, though. And Dr. Rao, I'm wondering if you could just comment on what you see as the primary barriers for us to try to be able to share the data. Or should the data be in the hands of the patient themselves?
Yeah, absolutely. I just came off a 7-day rotation of being on call, and I can tell you I had a patient who was literally admitted across the street at another hospital and came into our hospital with having continuous seizures. And I had no access to that data. So unfortunately, as many of you know, interoperability is lacking in the healthcare system, and there's just a tremendous amount of wealth of knowledge there where if we could, instead of being siloed between EMR data, prescription data, lab data, if we could harmonize that there's just so many insights we could glean from it.
Yeah, Sean, from your perspective, from a medical device perspective, is there a role that medical device companies play in trying to either create data, share data, or ingest data and make it more useful?
I think so. One of the primary work we're doing early on in commercialization is to really understand and appreciate kind of the latent disease that's existing in the undiagnosed population or the population that's in some kind of a workup, so that you can begin to do some sort of population health identification and also potentially do some earlier outreach. I mean, selfishly, our device works great earlier in disease, and so the ability to use combinations of claims and encounter data to try to identify individuals that might be showing some early symptomology or are in some kind of phase of their workup towards diagnosis is really important. And I think that also helps us have a proposition with the payers that makes sense, where we can truly identify the folks that are, for which this therapeutic will be most beneficial. And that's all going to be based on data science with the payers as well as with the provider community.
Okay. And that's a great way to start thinking about how do we appropriately diagnose, right? And I know there was some new data or some new studies that came out of AAIC around biomarkers. And I was wondering if one of you could comment on where do we see the actual diagnosis of Alzheimer's going?
Yeah. So I think a couple things, and again, I'm going to defer to Anitha what she's also seeing where she practices. So when we think about diagnosis, it's a clinical diagnosis. You still have to talk to a patient okay? I understand this is very interesting that you can do a brain scan or you can take some blood for a biomarker, but you have a patient in front of you and you still need to get a history and you still need to kind of get a sense of where they are when it comes to their brain health, their cognition. So I always want to put that forward. We do have criteria that we use in trying to ask questions if things have changed, and the key word here is change. What were you doing before? Are you doing it now? Is there a change? But what we just alluded to is we are moving the needle, if you will, from a clinical piece where something's happening to what could be happening that we're not seeing yet. So think of an iceberg and think of it being, you just see the tip of the iceberg. We're going underneath the water level to kind of see, is something brewing? Is something happening? And that's where it gets very exciting in this area, because we do have things that are picking things up before you outwardly express it. And as you mentioned, Steve, it's the biomarkers. So a biomarker can be many things. You can have a brain imaging biomarker, like an MRI or a PET scan. You can have a blood biomarker, which is where we're really gathering a lot of good data to say, could I find a protein in your blood that could be elevated to kind of give me an idea of a risk that you could be developing cognitive problems in the future. And that's where this is coming through. So it's almost like futurizing what can happen. And I think these biomarker assays are being developed. They're being commercialized. I would like to caution everyone here, though. We're still learning about these biomarkers, how they behave over the lifespan, okay? And I do have to mention this, that we are also trying to understand if you have medical conditions like diabetes or kidney disease, how are those biomarkers being affected? And this is so, so, so important, because our communities that we're thinking about biomarkers, and we're talking diverse communities, well, we have hypertension and we have diabetes and we have kidney disease. And if you're going to be developing biomarkers to predict cognitive change and you don't take that in consideration, then that's not accurate. And so that's something that we're really struggling with, because we don't have a lot of our minority or underrepresented groups participating in research for these biomarkers to see how those trajectories or how those things are manifesting. It's exciting, but I just want to be cautious that we really have to understand how do they change over the lifespan.
Dr. Rao, I want to just see if I can connect a couple dots here, because you said like this is is a chronic disease essentially that is not really treated like chronic disease. We know in underrepresented populations, cardiovascular disease is still a problem, diabetes still a problem. So how do we think about the patient experience in the future and try to make this a different story from what we've had in the past? I mean, how can we actually get out there and start to normalize, right, and try to get underrepresented minorities involved in clinical programs?
Well, I think one of the biggest challenges is disease awareness, not just among the lay community, but really even among clinicians. So if you look at how much education a typical primary care doctor or even a medical student gets in dementia or classifying dementia, it's probably a few hours, and maybe they test on the boards a couple questions, and then they're left to go practice. And often they're not screening people during annual wellness visits for Medicare. Only about 16% are maybe screened on a yearly basis. So there's a humongous amount of patients who are actually undiagnosed. The rates are somewhere between 50 to 60%. So when we even look at the prevalence numbers, I always tell people you may want to double that, because there's people who are just living with this disease and they come into the emergency room often with other chronic diseases. So, someone who forgets to take their insulin 3 times a day because they're agitated or they're hallucinating at home probably has undiagnosed dementia, but they're coming in with hyperglycemia. So going back to the data piece, a lot of these patients, you can't just do a simple query on ICD codes and say, oh, this person has dementia. You have to really get under the data and think about, okay, what are how can we create unique data models and say, these clusters of these chronic diseases may potentially put someone into a higher risk category of developing cognitive impairment. And then starting there, and then educating clinicians to say, let's screen these populations sooner before they end up in the ER with this hyperglycemia episode.
That would be the way to get our underrepresented groups engaged because they're coming in, if you will, to the physician's office or the ER with these issues. So it's, it's all about meeting people where they're at. This is what I'm coming in with, but then to say all these issues, as you said, and so rightfully so, they cluster together, they have risk, and how can we kind of then comprehensively look at it? And that's what we need to do instead of trying to put it out here, let's just do dementia out here. It just doesn't make sense. It's not logical, and I think we're really trying to push for that. It's this comprehensive look with the comorbid medical conditions.
It's interesting.
Yeah, and I think there's hidden in that, there's a real opportunity. If I put my public health hat on for a moment, everyone over 65 that's on Medicare, an annual cognitive screen is included in a Medicare annual visit. So we have the funding and the policy for population-based screening for folks over 65. Mm-hmm. And that, if you think about other disease states that have fought for that primary screening, just think about all of the cancer screenings and the work in mammography and colorectal screening. I mean, everyone's still kind of fighting an uphill battle on screening, and we actually have the policy and the payment in place. And if only 16% are getting that screening, that we have I guess we have kind of an almost above brand, type of opportunity to promote that awareness, but also to drive that awareness into an action, which is this annual screening opportunity.
Yeah.
And often there's also a reimbursement associated with the
Oh,
screening.
absolutely, yeah.
And I think only in 2017 or 2018 that CMS released this.
Right.
However, if you look at the claims data, maybe only 1 to 2% of providers nationally are actually utilizing the CPT code. So it's a huge public health problem. It's one of the reasons I personally went into neurology is, this was going to be the disease of my career, and I was like, hey, I want to be a dementia neurologist because, I want to make a difference here. This is a global problem. I mean, some of the stats you were giving earlier, 300 billion is in the U.S. If you look at the global spend of this disease, by 2050, we're estimating 1 trillion. That is the GDP of Saudi Arabia. So, just think about the enormity of this disease. And I think in our lifetimes, we'll definitely start seeing it more and more.
Yeah, I totally agree. Are there, so since you kind of brought up the sort of the global approach, is there anyone that happens to have a better handle on the problem than the U.S. does at this moment?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I mean, I think the global piece is really huge, though, because if you even look at the Asia-Pacific area, that is the area we're watching very, very closely from the population density there. So, I still remember in training, and I don't know if, Anita, you had this, well, certain ethnic groups don't get this. I used to hear that all the time, and it's like, are you kidding? Are you kidding? Yeah, well, no, we just don't get that. That's a Western disease. That's a Western type of disease. And, now we're understanding, no, ethnic groups are all getting this, so we're all into this. It's a question of, are you diagnosing and are you recognizing what it is versus being part of the normal cultural milieu that this is what we just expect. I think there are different countries that are trying to get the dementia plan, if you will, in place. So Europe, of course, is trying to lead the way in trying to get these strategic plans together, what to do with their populations. If you look over again, Asia, by the sheer enormity of the population there, you can imagine it's not as structured as well, although it's coming up now because the populations traditionally that weren't living that long are living longer. Yeah. And I think that's where now we're starting to see this change in thinking, like our populations. And then we have over in South America, again, very heavy, densely populated groups where we're seeing the dementia rates. One area of interest of research that I have is this global rate. What are the incidence rates? What are the prevalence rates globally? But what's coming interestingly here is now you can imagine the social determinants of health, right? You can see the different cultural issues. You can talk about education levels. All those things that we look at risk factors, how are they playing out in a global state? So that is the area of intense research. What can we learn? But I think right now there are countries that are really working hard. Canadians are working hard in this, the UK, to get these things under control. But they're all, in my opinion, they're all struggling. Yeah. But the Alzheimer Association is very heavy into this work, and a colleague and friend of mine, Rebecca Edelmeyer, is here from the association. Yeah. They put out great work, and you're looking at the association's looking at the global impact of this disease.
Great. No, I do want to spend a little bit of time on the social determinants. Yeah. Only because I think I saw a recent article where the Netherlands is doing now memory villages. And of course, like, we talk about like memory centers, memory care, housing for adults now. But as we think about the patient experience, is part of the solution here going to be architecting how these patients sort of manage through their disease instead of trying to catch it like we love to do, catch it and stop it? Do we have to recognize that we can't reach everybody and still have some place for them to go and sort of retain what they can retain?
Yeah. Question on memory villages.
I mean, it's a good point that you make that the experience for the patient might be very different in the future with these memory care villages. And the prevalence rates globally are going to, essentially ask governments, like, what are you going to do with this population?
Right.
You can't put everyone in a long-term care facility and just go away,
Right.
And the prevalence, I want to go back to that. I think that has a real interesting trickle-down impact into essentially how governments manage their funds in long-term care,
Exactly.
how insurance companies manage their reserves, how underwriting is practiced, and also how healthcare systems provide access to this geriatric population. I've also come across certain ER facilities that are just geriatric ERs that are purely just to manage this older population with dementia. So that's another unique approach that I think more people and more governments will have to look at, more countries will have to look at.
It's an interesting point. So just maybe taking it from the medical device perspective, as you think about your target population, like, are you trying to hone in on populations that have certain social determinants, geriatric population? What are you really trying to do to narrow the opportunity so that you get the FDA approval on the device?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the number one reason is make sure we've got a good representative sample for our phase 2 pilot. And so we are doing a very sort of sophisticated multi-site design to make sure that we're capturing the heterogeneity that we know is relevant to the disease state here. I mean, I think that's important, and making sure that we're powered to do the subgroup kind of analyses to kind of look for these differential treatment effects. And I think that's going to be very, very important. I think the other component of not just our device, but most of the pipeline drugs is it's really slowing the progress of this disease. And so I think that has a little bit different lens versus something that might be curative when you think about some of the assisted living here, where it's probably an eventuality that most people are going to go into some of those situations. And so if we're arresting the progress of disease, that doesn't necessarily mean that we're taking away that morbidity or the need for those support of the ADLs and functionality that you see in some of these settings. We also were trying to think about the therapeutics that can be done in-home or in an assisted kind of living setting versus some of the other neuromod that requires you to kind of go into an office. You don't take the TMS magnet home, if you will. And so what does that mean in terms, or you don't take it home yet. You probably will be able to at some point.
Probably.
Yeah.
But I think, Steve, I was just thinking about this. So we have these dementia-friendly communities, and there is this movement out there, and if you could Google it up, and you'll see that, how do you make your community aware of cognitive issues and dementia in your community, again, where you're at?
Love that.
And there is this, push, and I'm all for it. I've done home visits all my career. I love doing home visits. I did here in Chicago, where you really see how people are navigating through their communities, what's working, what's not, what are the barriers for them to stay at home. Every older person you talk to, for the most part, wants to stay in their home. Every single one. And if you are a caregiver providing care to your parent or a grandparent, you know that. I don't want to go, and there's always that tension of when do you want to say you need to come out? So what can we do to keep you in your home? And this is where these devices are coming in. What can we do that can keep you safe in your home, but still give me feedback that I need to monitor, whether it be your medications, your blood pressure, et cetera. And I think this is where we have this massive opportunity here because we have so many people who are saying they're not leaving. And then the other thing we're seeing trending is multi-generationals are coming back, where now we are having multi-generational in one home, and really paying attention to that and embracing that we need to help people out with devices and things that are going to keep them in place as long as they can.
And I
Yeah.
think that's a really good point you touch on, because that opens up the commercialization opportunities for devices
Right.
for other innovative companies that are looking to delay placement into nursing home.
Right.
One of the biggest challenges as a provider I see is when I have to see a patient and their family and say, yeah, I think it's time to put mom in a nursing home. And the first question I get asked is, how am I going to afford
Right.
$10,000 a month?
Exactly.
And that price is just going to keep going up, the cost of care. And if we can start introducing this idea of, wellness, or even a device to essentially kind of take that trajectory and move it and shift it so that even a delay of 6 months is
Exactly.
huge. It's huge for the patient, the family, and then ultimately also the payer. So, I think there's some really interesting parallels we can create, interesting business models, business cases around that topic.
It's great. It's a great point. So just to kind of calibrate where we are, so we obviously have all these therapeutics that if they can delay that that eventuality, but then the experience that we have on the opposite side is still going to be there. So I do want to talk a little bit about on the experience of getting to the therapeutics, right? And we've obviously had a lot of missteps maybe recently, and so I'm wondering if one of the panelists could comment on what have we really learned from the experience of Aduhelm and others in the market that will help us going forward to really get to that patient who needs it, to delay the onset of Alzheimer's, get them on therapy sooner.
Well, I think there's a lot of things that we've learned. I can give you some personal takeaways from our experience with Aduhelm. One of the things that came out very quickly and very obvious to me with my colleagues that I was sitting with was that although you have a drug that is showing a biological response, i.e. removing the protein in the brain, the amyloid, because the clinical response was not hitting a home run, it didn't seem like it was enough for us. That really tempered a lot of people's enthusiasm for it. So when my colleagues were telling me this and listening on calls, I could only extrapolate that to the primary care, to the geriatricians, to everybody else treating the patient, saying the same thing to me. If clinically it's not working, or I don't see results, or the family doesn't see results, just to have a biological change may not be the thing that is so amazing. And I have to say that because I speak to a lot of physicians that are not neurologists. And I would get these comments. Well, clinically, if I don't see anything or they don't see anything, why would you do that? The price tag, of course, came into being. And I thought the price tag, when that came out, what it was costing, and yes, we did get a reduction, but that initial shock of what it's costing when you have a disease that is affecting so many people and disproportionately in our underrepresented groups, that was also a big misstep. And it was kind of like, the toothpaste is out of the tube. How do you get this back in now and try to do that? And then the third thing that I thought, when I learning about this is that drug development, and when the drugs are coming through and they're coming through trials, please, and I say this to my colleagues because they do trials, please look at your composition in your trials. If you have predominantly white populations in our trials, as we do, and you are dealing with the disease that we just told you is global and it's disproportionately affecting our underrepresented groups, this is a problem. It's a big problem because you are basing your results on a population that is not representative of the population here in the US, and I'm speaking in the US. And I think those were the big three learning pieces. It doesn't mean we're stopping, right, Steve? We're going ahead, and we should. But I'm hoping that we're understanding these were very big three issues that have to be worked in parallel as you move it forward. Not like, oh, we'll do this now and we'll do this now.
I think you make a great point, about sort of the endpoints and what matters. And I think that when you can incorporate things like MMSE or MoCA, when you can include the functionality measures or ADL assessment, I think that also helps to kind of contextualize to the patient and the caregiver what it is required to be compliant or to adhere to either pharmacotherapy or a device. And I think being able to kind of give them a little bit of a scorecard so that they can understand. Exactly. And I think, not being a clinician, but from what I hear from clinicians is it's kind of about those activities of daily living, or what stability some of those treatments can provide. It's probably not going to gain back any functionality, but there might be a stabilization. And I think that sounds like it's very satisfying to a lot of patients to have that feeling of some degree of stability.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think there's opportunities to create new endpoints in these trials. Right. Often it's like a composite score of a neuropsych that we're looking at. But what does that really mean to the person's quality of life? Does that mean they can drive? Does that mean they can keep their job longer? Does that mean they can stay at a nursing home? I mean, these are the things that I think really make a difference for our patients and our caregivers. And then that's ultimately, I think, the thing that's going to make, if the price tag is the price tag, that you can start working backwards from that price tag and say, hey, I kept this person out of a nursing home for this many years, or I could keep them driving. And, I mean, these are like meaningful things for our patients. And the second thing I was going to mention is one other setback that I think some trials that had just been published also faced was the adoption of the clinical piece. Like, how many patients are going back to how many patients are getting screened, but there's an incredible stigma of this disease among clinicians. It is kind of like what cancer was in the 70s. A lot of my colleagues who are primary care docs are saying, what's the point in me making this diagnosis, because there's no treatment. The treatment out there is not currently working. And it's just, it's almost like a death sentence. I don't want to say this to the patient. And so that, again, has some huge impacts into the data that is being recorded in the EMR. So even though they look like they're looking like, walking like, talking like they have Alzheimer's disease, it's not in the EMR. And the doctor hasn't told the patient. And you can imagine, let's say that patient is chronic medical disease, has COPD, pulmonary hypertension, kidney failure, and their other doctors, their other subspecialists don't know either. So, it has huge impacts, this idea of stigma. So I would encourage the new clinical trial sites, the new pharmaceutical companies that are manufacturing these drugs, please talk to the doctors who are prescribing this and educate them on why it's important to diagnose. It's not just to diagnose adios. Like, there's a huge reason why we do this.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, you bring up a sort of an interesting point around just the providers feeling the stigma. So as we're, again, maybe trying to focus on that patient experience, if you had your druthers, right, and you could actually encourage medical schools to treat properly on this, is the intent that, since they're already recording the COPD, every other chronic disease, that this now somehow becomes just another chronic disease that has a gradation that can then get treated over time?
I think we're already in that to an extent. When we think about the chronicity, if you will, of people. I mean, you think about cancer, people who've had cancer, been treated for cancer, they're living with cancer, they're a survivor. Cardiovascular is a great example. Had a heart attack, they're a survivor of a heart attack, cardiovascular, they're living with cardiovascular disease. So we're trying to think about this, living with, if you will, a dementia. And if you have that framework in your mind, then it's like, how are we managing this then? And I think, again, I keep going back to cardiovascular disease. I've been very fortunate to work with cardiologists at Rush. I have a cardiocog clinic where I'm in the cardiology suite, and I will do screenings with people in cardiology because they're complaining of cognition. And it's been very interesting over the years, because the thinking is, well, can you just kind of damp it down? Not curative, damp it down. And I'm thinking, okay, so the patients are understanding. I have heart disease. You're not going to get rid of my heart disease, but you're going to at least keep it under control. And how does cardiology do that? They look at risk algorithms. They look at different medications. They have multiple medications in cardiovascular disease. And patients are, yep, we're going to do this, we're going to do this, we're going to do this. And I think if we kind of get to that, the way we think about cognition, and especially when you start to see change, we'll be making real change with people to understand that. It's almost like an A1C. You have a number, you go above the number, we're going to try to bring that number down. Well, if we go into the biomarker world, that's exactly what it's going to be. This number is going to be higher, we're going to bring that number down through a treatment. And that's where I have the biggest hope. We're speaking the language that people are already used to coming in the healthcare system, and we in the dementia field are adapting that language, not just putting it out there as something so different when that's right, Anita, the stigma then is there because it's this thing out there, and instead of bringing it into the everyday clinical flow, right?
And cardiology is a great example also for this kind of the success of the polytherapy of devices and drugs, as well as what some people do lifestyle modification.
Exactly.
I hear,
Exactly.
you know?
Exactly.
And I think it's a good example also from the data. I mean, the Framingham Heart Study
Right.
and all the data science that went into that for multi-generations.
And if you think of cardiology, and again, it's just, I've learned so much as a neurologist being in the cardiology suite, the amount of wearables they do, and all the devices are going on with patients in cardiology. And, right now we just heard about this big trial with Apple Watches and AFib. I mean, this is how we should be thinking about dementia care. And if you do that, people then understand, and you make that connection about brain health, that there is this cardiovascular and this vascular component to cognition. I think that's where we should be focusing our attention. And people will be like, yeah, I get it.
I think we do that now in stroke, right?
Yeah,
So we
exactly.
always tell patients, okay, the heart and the brain are connected.
Right.
You had undiagnosed AFib, that's why you had this stroke.
Right, exactly.
And then it makes sense. And I think kind of taking that and then applying it to cognition is a really good opportunity, and also highlights the fact that there's actually heterogeneous number of dementias out there.
Exactly.
And that's one thing I want to also point out here. We focus a lot on Alzheimer's disease, but there's actually 15 types of dementia. And each one has a different risk score, different mortality, different cost of care. So
Yeah.
it's incredibly important to kind of, even going back to the clinical trial piece, making sure that you get the right true positives in your patient population, and then treating them going forward. So the more discussions we can have around this topic, I think that increases the awareness among patients, caregivers, but then also clinicians.
Yeah, so you kind of both gave me an opening, and I'm going to go for it because focusing a bit on patient experience, Apple and the AFib trial, Apple is not a provider, right? And historically, providers have not been sort of bastions of great experience, customer experience, et cetera. So maybe I'll start with you, Sean. So is it really up to some of the technology companies to really take the reins and try to say, hey, this is something that you can do, like very similar to the AliveCor, cardio?
Yeah, I think so, and I think we're seeing device and drug and the provider side innovation in care pathways and upgrading the standard of care, and then the use of digital therapeutics. And you just see the rise. It seems like every day there's a new digital therapeutic out with some really great effectiveness data. And when we think about specifically our device, there's no way it will work and reach the people we want to if we just drop it off in the care setting. We're not going to fill your office
Right.
with it, and so you can just fulfill there, right? We got to create a real episode of care and understand all of the workflow that goes into that. And I think there's a role for all of these things. In fact, I don't really know of a disease where you have a monotherapy. That's the blockbuster monotherapy, and that's all you do. And so I think appreciating what does this true dementia care look like is going to be a real important aspect. And digital is going to have a big play in adherence. And I think also giving the patients and their providers the kind of feedback they need. How am I doing? How am I pacing?
So, and again, I'm a big proponent for digital, but I also want to just make people aware who can afford it. Do you know who your patient population is?
Yeah.
And this is so, so, so important. So if you're talking, and this is what we face, if we're talking to primary care or we're talking to a physician group, I'm going to just say in a rural area, and we're talking everything digital, and they're looking at us like, what are you saying? You have no clue how we practice. You have no clue our people here.
Yeah.
And it's terrible when this happens, because what happens then is they completely shut down and they don't want to hear anything about the possibility of what it could be, because you just did not do your homework in knowing your people and your community. And that means, what is the average income? What is the Wi-Fi network? What are you asking them to do? Who is in the home? Can they do this? And these are things that, unfortunately, the companies that I've spoken to, I try to call them out on this.
Yeah.
Talk to me, do you know? Well, no, everybody does this. No, not everybody has a smartphone. There are people walking around with a flip phone, okay? And they like their flip phone. So how are we going to reach that person? And I think, you know, again, cardiology has worked through this because they're seeing the uptake may not be high, but we in dementia care have to be very cognizant, and we are. We're being very open about you don't know your group, you don't know your population. And I think that's where the rub is.
Dr. Rao, I mean, you're such a unique position, you know, being both a clinician and having a company.
Yeah.
So are there certain providers that are reaching out and trying to do the things that we're really talking about, understand the patient community, understand the different types of dementia that they could be treating?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's certainly some clinicians who are very digital first, and they want to adopt these technologies in their practices. They face a couple challenges, however. Sometimes it's just the workflow, like Sean said, like getting the workflow, like I was just talking to Dr. Agarwal before this, I said, you know, when I'm in clinical practice, I see 100 opportunities when I'm in practice, and I'm like, oh, this device would be great here, this new biomarker would be great here. But then fortunately what happens is operationalizing these digital tools is the biggest barrier. And getting doctors or clinicians to just adopt some of these technologies. And I would encourage a lot of the companies here today, talk to a clinician, figure out their workflow, and figure out where it fits. I mean, I think a lot of people sometimes say, oh, this is a very cool tool. Of course everyone's going to use it. And it's like, not really. And it's due to sometimes the patient, right?
Yeah.
And they may not have access to that, but it's also the
Except the doctor,
clinician.
yeah.
Like, they're just, you know, packed in the day seeing 25 patients. They're not going to do this tablet-based test. I mean, how are you going to fit that in there?
Exactly.
So yeah, please talk to us.
Excellent. And so I think that's actually something between now and 2040 we can start to build some of those
You can
bridges.
talk to clinicians.
Talk to clinicians, yeah.
No, I think that's a really great point. We just, actually, Dr. Rao participated in some KOL work we just did, and it's, from our point of view, even the folks that think they know the payers and think they know the providers, it was really amazing what kind of comes out when you talk to people who are kind of in clinic every day and thinking about not just social determinants, but just those activities of daily living. And I like the point you made earlier about what matters is what's changed.
Right.
Like
It's a change.
if I've always
Yeah.
been forgetful and it's been aggravating since I was a kid,
Yeah.
maybe that's
If you
not
never balanced a
interesting.
checkbook and you can't do it now, I don't care. I mean, I've said it all the
Right.
time. If you've never been able to do it, that's not of interest to me. Tell me the next thing that you've noticed, right? But I do want to make this thing, so talk to a clinician, even better yet, why don't you spend some time in an office? And why don't you shadow her in the
Great.
unit and shadow me and see that the board has 150 people coming through this clinic today?
Wow.
And just be there, not saying anything. It's like hanging a camera, but just be there, and then you get a really good idea of what's happening.
Yeah.
And then you are informed, and you will come back and say, wow, what am I thinking is to do this tablet? We have 15 minutes, and rooming takes 5, and by the time they come down the hall, it's 3, and before you know it, we can't get the tablet, and the Wi-Fi isn't working. I mean, all that stuff, you know what it is? It's gone. Thanks. It sounded good, out. And I think we need to have people start coming in the settings to see what's really happening.
So let's go beyond just starting.
Yeah.
And so we have a few questions that have come in, but before we do, I just wanted to ask one final question. So let's assume we are in the year 2040, right? So tell me, as a potential patient, potential caregiver for someone with Alzheimer's, how is the care going to be different in the year 2040?
I'll go first. I think I'm really hopeful that there'll be new care delivery, mainly with telemedicine, and there's more integration of that data on the back end. So it might be the wearable, the imaging, the lab data, prescription data is coming into a unified platform and then delivered to the patient via tele, because a lot of our patients, you know, it's incredibly hard to bring them into the office. And sometimes after the first visit, you don't really need to see them again in terms of face-to-face. And I think hopefully by 2040, we're starting to move in that direction. So care delivery is where I'm putting my ticket.
I'd love to see some really broad-based awareness. Like, would cognition or some measure of brain health be an additional vital sign? Do we do public health screening at large? Is that number not 16%, but it's 16% of people don't get that screening? And do we have just an appreciation of the disease as a chronic disease, and there's awareness of it? There's hopefully a little prevention we'll learn about the science. There's some really interesting evidence around semaglutide and some of the inflammatory processes as being preventative or protective against disease or disease progression. And I hope patients have the ability to choose among first line or the sequence of therapies that they might want. Is a device more preferable? Would I want to do pharmaceutical? And can I tune that kind of in a personalized perspective based on my other morbidity? Because one fascinating thing we've found in some of the data science recently is what the other morbidity is on board. Not to mention what other pharma and what other treatments and things like that are on board, but it's a really complex constellation of conditions. And I hope that we could basically look back and say, you remember when we made the analogy to cardiology, maybe we're almost there in terms of that treatment.
Dr. Agarwal?
I like to see more care coordination, so kind of what you just heard here. But from when you're coming in with the concern, whatever it is, that you have a family history of this disease, because again, that's a very real issue too. People are coming in to see us who do not have cognitive issues, but they have a family history. And they see it at Thanksgiving, they see it in July 4th, they see it at Christmas, they see it in any of their holidays, and it's right in their face. And it's a concern. So this is at that personalized care, like, what can we do? So when start to end, I want the coordination to be seamless. So if I say something, these are the tests we're going to do, but here's the next step. Then here's the next step. And if you need a caregiver needs to get educated, here's where they're going to get the education. Then here's where we're going to get social support for you. Here you can talk to the lawyer. I mean, I would love to see this total coordination so that people know that I may not need all this now, but there's a plan. And there is a nice logical, a logical and a thoughtful way of how we're going to handle this so that they can come back and we can talk about wearables and new treatments and things like that. But right now, it's not. And it's fragmented, and it's very frustrating. And I think to an extent, that's why a lot of doctors aren't even saying it. We don't want to say the A word because they keep thinking, if I say that, there's a lot of other stuff that has to happen. And right now, I know that coordination's not there. And I know it, so I'm not going to say it. And that's terrible because you know it. And yet, if that's what's holding people back, that's terrible. Like mental health care right now is terrible. It's the exact same thing. You're diagnosing mental health issues and you can't see a provider for 7 months. In a healthcare situation as a physician, what is that about?
So before we leave that analog, that is such a, I think for everyone, that's a huge pain point right now. And I think it just, I sit on the board of a community mental health center, and you would just see this tsunami, especially now of adolescent mental health issues. In that particular case, like we are struggling to find providers. So what is in the neurological setting, the equivalent of trying to find a lower cost provider that can do the awareness, that can do the coordination, right? These don't necessarily need to be neurologists that do this, that kind of have really the charge to really make that patient experience better.
Go ahead. You want to start? Okay, so I think the NPs, I think if you have a nurse practitioner that's been trained by the neurologist, what this clinic is looking like, what we need to do, I think an NP does a fantastic job to get the initial history and to get things together about how things have been progressing. I think they do a fantastic job, and they work a lot of times with neurologists, but they could also work with the geriatrician. They could also work with a primary care physician. So that, I think, is wonderful. The other thing could also be what we would say community health workers. They are tremendous out in the community to keep the education going. And again, they are hungry to learn about this because they see it every day and they want to give out accurate information and they do want to serve their community. So by them being out in the field, they then can help when someone does come in. They've been primed a little bit that this is what we're looking at, this is why we're talking about things. And then the last group of people that I think I've used that I thought have been very helpful are social workers. Social workers who are really trained and the latest when it comes to dementia, diagnosis and care, but they also are valuable because they can already help with the assistance of the social and get things happening. And they can then get to programs that are helpful. So the association had a Direct Connect program that I used to use quite a bit. And I would sit and see patients and in cardiology, and we would sit there and say, we need extra information on this. And it went to the Alzheimer Association. And I said, you're going to get a call in 72 hours. And they did. And they reported back to me. That those things are there. So that's what I'm thinking. Social workers, NPs, neurologist, and then, of course, the physician, the PCP or the geriatrician.
Great.
Yeah, and I think we've done a good job of this in the stroke world, where
Yes,
there's a stroke neurologist, and then there's a team of either NPs or PAs that are seeing the patient, triaging them in the ER,
Right.
and then reporting back to the neurologist. So I think there's some good pathways that have already been built that we could essentially kind of model in the dementia world. So that, I think that could potentially work really well.
I'll put my payer hat on, and I think the payers have a role in some care coordination here. You know, how much friction they introduce into the process, I guess, is the question. But I think that they are sitting on a lot of claims data. They are the kind of the central information hub, at least, of what utilization and what dispensing is happening. And I think there is an opportunity to develop some of those payer-provider partnerships where we sort of agree on that standard of care, and but some of the, like the administrative burden and some of the workflow burden maybe should be you know, kind of a little bit more on the payer side of things than maybe burdening the system. But that going back to your incentives comment, that's you got to have the right incentives aligned to make that happen.
You know, I'm going to hold you to that.
Good,
Hopefully you're speaking on behalf of all payers.
Good. I hope so.
A couple questions. We are getting questions from the social QA, and thanks everyone for sending those in. Question from the panel: Do you see a world in which we can predict dementia onset before there are any symptoms whatsoever? And if so, you know, do you see opportunities for early intervention?
I do. Yeah, I
We
do.
talked about
Yeah,
heterogeneity of
we're in the
dementia.
process of this, exactly, where we're going to be looking to predict and trying to get predictive models. And what are the key characteristics that you may have? What are your blood biomarkers showing? How is your brain scans? How is that coming in? It's this multi-level approach, which is, to me, very exciting because it's not just one thing. You're not just hanging it on one thing. And it also means to me that if you were to change one thing out of this multi-level approach, wow, you could maybe change your risk. And that's really where it's at. So if I say these are the three things that I'm looking at, can we modify this through a lifestyle change? Can we do this? And that would then totally rechange. It's like an algorithm. Totally rechanges what the algorithm comes up in, I think.
Yeah, and
we're getting close.
I was really excited at AIC because I realized there was actually so many different types of biomarkers.
Yeah.
I think in the past we've only kind of looked at amyloid, and at least that's been the main headlines. But being at this conference, I realized, wow, there's people who are looking at proteomics, gut microbiomes,
Right.
other pathways in the CNS like microglial, which is more in the MS world. So it was just fascinating to be there and realize, gosh, there's almost a multimodal approach that we could start using for biomarkers.
Sorry.
Well, I wonder how that also helps patients. So you were mentioning someone coming in talking about family history. You know, what
Right.
does it really mean if you're APOE4 positive?
Right,
You know,
exactly.
or double positive,
Right.
or, you know, and kind of contextualizing that a
Exactly.
little bit more for folks.
And I think you're touching on this other issue that's coming up in our area. It's disclosure and communication of results. This is something I'm heavily involved with, and this is something that is so important. You can get a test done, but what does it mean, just what you're saying, and what does it mean in the collective? And if you can't disclose that result effectively and communicate that, it does a lot of damage, and it's doing a lot of damage, and we saw the damage coming with the genetic testing. And that people were getting testing done, or 23andMe and those things, and then they're getting this panel back, and they're like, well, what does this mean? And nobody was explaining really what it meant. A lot of anxiety, a lot of stress, a lot of people, and family discord coming in here. Like, you ordered this, and now you have it, now you don't know what it means, now I have to think about it. So I think we really have to be mindful and we have to be thoughtful when it comes to disclosure and what are we telling our people when we're ordering these tests. That this is what we're ordering, this is what it means, this is what it doesn't mean, and that just brings up more education, right? Because who's going to explain that? But we're headed that way for sure.
It's really, are we consenting people appropriately for tests?
Exactly
Yeah.
right.
And
exactly
really the
right.
meaningfulness of the result.
Right. A meaningful result. Yeah.
Yeah. One quick last question, and I think you kind of addressed this, but this one's a big one. Considering how many primary care physicians there are versus how many neurologists there are, shouldn't the medical community be doing more in terms of HCP education on this topic?
Yes. I can tell you that neurology is actually an elective in medical school, so a lot of people don't even do neurology, and they get away and they go and practice in primary care. So I'm really hopeful that in this dialogue and in this kind of initiative that a lot of organizations are realizing, wow, dementia is a huge problem. How can we start the earliest? Like, can we go back to medical school and make this not an elective anymore?
Exactly.
Like, it's a requirement because the geriatric population is huge. And the same thing with internal medicine, primary care doctors. When they're in training, again, neurology is an elective. And when they spend time in neurology, if they choose to, they're seeing like the acute stroke patients, but they're not seeing these chronic diseases that we manage and how to manage them and how to manage the psychosocial aspect of it. And how to even have that disclosure dialogue, because I can tell you, like, I always tell people, you really don't want to see a neurologist. We usually have bad news. and it's like there's an art to saying, looks like mom has dementia. I'm sorry, you look like your MRI looks like you have MS. I mean, people remember the words you say, and there should be some training. Really around that experience.
That's great. And it's sort of a good way to kind of start to ease us out to the kind of the big problem I think that we have to address. A couple takeaways I had, though, as we think about the patient experience 2040, we really have one to fix on the front end, which is getting that patient to the diagnosis and treatment, right? But then also, for those that eventually do progress, what's their experience going to look like, and how can we make that better for them, potentially stave off future deterioration. But there's a lot of work to do around care coordination, right, that we can do, but also a lot of work that can be done on the medical device and pharmaceutical side. I do want to thank you all for being part of this panel. And people don't know, but Dr. Agrawal said, I'll only do this panel if you make sure it's not a one-off. And so we're working to try to do.
Them, never let them.
Yeah. So we're working to try to do a demo day with hopefully with Matters partnership for Alzheimer's Month in November. So thank you all for being on part of the panel. Thank you, Matter, for the hosting, and thank you for the audience for coming today.
Thanks, everyone.